Dear students, in this series of lectures, we are going to deal with a great jurist, an eminent lawyer, a powerful and influential political leader, a great messiah for weaker section of the society, Dr.B.R.Ambedkar, who carved out a place for himself in Indian politics and had a great contribution on social change in India. In this lesson, we are going to discuss the following topics on Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Life sketch of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. In the interface between the colonialism and nationalism in India, Ambedkar was to intervene in his own distinctive way and attempt shape issues and perceptions, particularly from the later half of 1920s. The platform of the untouchables, in which he invested much of his life work, became his launching pad. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the struggle for socio-political space in India, untouchability as a distinct social entity, came to be recognized only in the 20th century. Earlier, even the most emphatic of social reforms such as Jyotirao Phule and Narayana Guru Swami in the 19th century and early 20th centuries located it within the framework of the caste system. It was 1911 census which for the first time brought home the awesome proportion of what was hitherto described as the depressed castes or classes. The Congress issued the call for the removal of social disabilities suffered by these classes only in 1970. By the early 1920s, the untouchables had begun to organize themselves as an autonomous political constituency at the all India level with its base in the provinces. Ambedkar stepped into the public domain at the juncture. He argued that the emancipation of untouchables had to be fought for the untouchables themselves, with any support forthcoming from the others, and that movement of the untouchables was an integral part of the universal movement for freedom, equality and belonging to the society as a whole. From this perspective, the national movement itself came to be judged in terms of the twofold objectives, that is, to what extent it would further the emancipation of the untouchables and the extent to which it would herald an order embodying freedom, equality of social and economic consideration and the bond of community. Ambedkar belonged to the Mahar caste, one of the numerous untouchable castes in Maharashtra. His ancestral village was Ambavade in Mandangad Taluk of Ratnagiri district of the erstwhile Bombay province. The region underwent a momentous social, economic and political upheaval in the wake of the European mercantile and later political expansion. Mahars in this region joined the British Army in large numbers. Ambedkar himself was born on 14th April 1891 in Mau near Indore, where his father Ramji Sakpal was the instructor in the local military school. Ramji, like the Mahars of western Maharashtra, was deeply attached to the devotional mythical Varkhari sect. He became a follower of the Kabir Panth and was an admirer of Jyotirao Phule, who pioneered major reforms among the lower castes in Maharashtra from the later part of the 19th century. There was much devotional singing and recitation of holy text in Ambedkar house. His mother, Bhima Boy, belonged to Mahar Kabir Panthi household that boasted of several generations of military service in British Army. She died in 1896 in Sitara, where Ramji had found a job after his retirement from army. Ambedkar was then just 5 years old. Of the 14 children of Ramji and Bhima Bai, only 5 survived, the youngest being Ambedkar. Although Ambedkar belonged to the highly respected Mahar community, he experienced the pangs of untouchability when he had to interact with people of social layers beyond the confines of the untouchable castes. You must remain in your assigned place seemed to be the constant refrain of the rest of the world. Ramji dreamt of a different future of his sons. He admitted Ambedkar to Elphinstone High School, where the boy completed matriculation in 1907. They lived in Paral, then populated by textile labor, where social cleavages, this time in an urban setting, were negotiated not without conflict with the demands of industrial employment. Ambedkar married Ramabai, who was just 9 years old in 1908. He completed his BA from Elphinstone College in 1912 with English and Persian as his subjects, with some financial assistance from Maharaja Sajrao of Baroda. A certain facility in Persian and cultured world it embodied is visible in several of Ambedkar's writings. Ambedkar joined the armed forces of Baroda as a lieutenant after his BA, but had to return to Bombay within a few days when news of the death of his father reached him. However, he secured one of the two scholarships which the Maharaja of Baroda had instituted for backward caste students to study abroad, and joined the Columbia University in 1913. It was here that Ambedkar came to shape his learning and perspectives from great teachers such as John Dewey, Edwin Sigman, and A. Goldweiser. Columbia University itself was the throes of major institutional refocusing during this period in an attempt to cultivate leaders and professionals for the great American society. For the future social scientific knowledge was perceived as a reliable guide for the formulation of appropriate policy measures. Here, Ambedkar completed an MA with a dissertation on administration and finance of East India Company and his PhD on national dividend, a historical and analytical study. He also wrote a major paper on castes in India, their mechanism, genesis and development. However, degrees of British universities were the mark of excellence then, particularly in India. The ensued privileges for its recipients in their academic and professional careers. Considering Ambedkar's orientation and the inclination of Edwin Sigman, his guide, the London School of Economics, seemed a better option. Given its progressive ambience, Sigman introduced Ambedkar to Sidney Webb, the economist and socialist, one of the founders of London School of Economics, in glowing terms. Ambedkar joined the college in 1916. He imbibed a great deal of Fabianism from Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and came to privilege the role of state as expounded by J. A. Hobson and L. T. Hobhouse, then members of the faculty and prominent members of the school known the British Idealism. He also joined Gray's Inn for the Bharat Law. However, he had interrupted his studies and returned to India in 1917. As he had executed a bond to serve the Baroda state in return for the scholarship for study abroad. However, the environment at Baroda, both at Accountant General's office, where he was placed as probationer, and outside, became humiliating and hostile once people got to know that he was an untouchable. He returned to Bombay and picked up some odd jobs, but remained mainly unemployed. He was appointed as professor of political economy as Sydenham College, which was then modelled on the pattern of the London School of Economics. He made submissions before the Southwark Committee in January 1919, which was inquiring into the issues of franchise on the eve of Montague Chelmsford reforms of 1919. He pleaded for a separate electorate for depressed classes and had been considered for Muslims. He also started fortnightly called Mukhyak on 31st January 1920. In his opening issue, he pleaded its necessity at a forum to deliberate on the injustices let loose or likely to be imposed on us and other depressed people, and to think of their future development and appropriate strategies towards critically. In 1920, he collaborated with Sahu Maharaj of Kobalpur in forming the Depressed Classes Forum, which organized the first All India Conference of the Depressed Classes in Nagpur, where he argued that emancipation of the depressed classes was possible only through their own initiative. Ambedkar rejoined the London School of Economics in September 1920. He obtained an MSc degree in 1921, which was essential to proceed on the doctoral studies. He worked on the problem of rupee, the dissertation for his DSc under Edwin Cannon, one of the best known professors of economics of that time. This thesis was published by King and Co., London in 1923 under the title of The Problem of the Rupee, Its Origin and Its Solution. In 1925, Ambedkar's PhD thesis at Columbia University was brought out by the same publishers under the title The Evaluation of Provincial Finance in British India. In 1922, Ambedkar spent 3 months at Berlin attempting to pursue further studies there, but could not proceed as he had to return to London in connection with his DSc at the London School of Economics. In 1922, he was called to the bar at Gray's Inn, London. Ambedkar returned to India in 1923 and started legal practice at the Bombay High Court. He taught mercantile law part-time at Butley Poll's Accountancy Training Institute, Bombay, from June 1925 to March 1928. From June 1928 to March 1929, he was professor of law in the Government Law College, Bombay. In 1924, Ambedkar founded the Bakshikrit Hitkarani Sabha. The organization started a hostel in Sholapur for depressed classes. In 1927, he led the famous Mahad Satyagraha, or non-violent resistance to assert the right of the untouchables to have access to wells and tanks used by all. This resulted in confrontation with the caste Hindus. The Manusmriti was publicly burnt by Ambedkar and his followers on 25th December 1927 to show that untouchables were no longer prepared to abide by the religious and ritual confinement upheld by caste Hindus. On 3rd April 1927, Ambedkar had begun publishing a fortnightly journal, Rabishkrit Bharat. As its name suggested, it was an attempt to wrest the initiative for the depressed classes in their struggles. During this period, Ambedkar attempted to radicalize the initiatives taken by Gandhi to bring about social transformation and weave the nation together. He introduced a bill in the Bombay legislature for amending the Bombay Hereditary Offices Act 1874, which would have benefited particularly the Watandar Mahars by freeing them from traditional social bonds and duties and letting them pursue vocations of their choice. He formed Samaj Samada Sangh in September 1927 and the Samata Sainik Dal in December 1927, organizations meant to vigorously pursue the agenda of social equality. Ambedkar, who was appointed as a member of the Legislative Assembly of Bombay Province in 1927 for 5 years, the appointment was renewed in 1932 for the further 5 years, attempted to maintain the radical edge in his crusade while carrying out his duties in the assembly. His speeches on the budget inveighed against the burden imposed on the poor, taking the administration to task for being neither representative nor accountable. As a member of the committee of the Bombay legislature deputized for the purpose, he submitted a statement before the Indian Statutory Commission, popularly known as the Simon Commission, on 29th May 1928, that differed from the rest of the committee. The statement is a major text on constitutional democracy, depicting the perspective of the depressed classes and outlining Ambedkar's political stance for years to come. He also submitted a statement on behalf of the Bakshikrit Hitkarani Sabha on the state of education of the depressed classes and made a plea for an administrative based on universal adult franchise. He also gave oral evidence before the commission in October 1928. In June 1928, he took the initiative for the establishment of depressed classes education society, which established hostels in Panvel, Thane, Nasik, Pune and Dharwad for high school students belonging to these sections. Ambedkar also played a prominent part in the Kalaram temple movement in 1930 for the entry of the depressed classes to this temple in Nasik. He also became the president of the All India Depressed Classes Congress in Nagpur in August 1930. Ambedkar's experience of a decade of political involvement in the 1920s drove home certain lessons. The British administration was not sympathetic to the plea of untouchables. In fact, one of the choicest indictment of the colonial authority from the perspective of this class was to be written by Ambedkar during this period. Ambedkar also realized that upper caste were not prepared to bring about or even concede to social and religious changes that embodied equality. He felt that Gandhi was too soft on orthodox and its proponents. As the 1930s advanced, Ambedkar increasingly turned against Gandhi and also against what he called Brahmanism. Ambedkar started a fortnightly called Janata on 24th November 1930, which became weekly after a year. It was later published Prabudh Bharat from 4th February 1956. Ambedkar attended the first roundtable conference in London in 1930, representative of the depressed classes. They started adopted by representatives of various communities and interests. The pressures exerted by several associations of depressed classes in India, the near impossibility of introduction of universal adult franchise and eventually the attitude of the Congress and Gandhi towards untouchables drove Ambedkar to change his stance in favor of a separate electorate for the depressed classes. It was the second roundtable conference that Ambedkar came to a head-on collision with Gandhi. When there was an impasse between contending interests, Ambedkar negotiated with the representatives of minorities and assigned a pact called Minorities Pact. The Roundtable Conference was a major platform from which Ambedkar deployed his learning and ability to think on his feet to supreme effect. He advanced alternative documents for possible constitutional reforms in India. Several suggestions then voiced and expressed in these documents were to be incorporated in India Act 1935. The bombshell was the Communal Award of 1932 that granted a separate electorate to the untouchables. Gandhi restored to the fast and to death against the award as he had threatened at the Roundtable Conference. The award left space for changes. If the communities concerned suggested an alternative scheme, a Levi Ambedkar used a negotiate on behalf of the depressed classes, resulting in the Pune Pact. The core of this pact was the promise of joint electorate with the reservation for depressed classes, a decision that anticipated the 1950 Constitution of India, but this pact could not satisfy anyone eventually. The Orthodox Hindus rallied against Gandhi for conceding too great a share of seats to depressed classes, while Ambedkar felt that the joint electorate was a mechanism for selecting a member of the depressed classes who was acceptable to caste Hindus rather than someone who could authentically represent the interest of the untouchables. He said the communal award was intended to free the untouchables from the thraldom of the Hindus. The Pune Pact is designed to place them under the domination of the Hindus. Ambedkar became a member of the Indian Franchise Committee, popularly known as Lothian Committee, in December 1931, that looked into the issue of franchise and representation as recorded by the Roundtable Conference. Touring the country, he found that there was an attempt to scale down the existence of the depressed classes both qualitatively and qualitatively. Following the Pune Pact, an anti-untouchability league, later named as the Harijan Sevak Sangh, was set up. Ambedkar accepted the membership of the executive committee following the erofia of the pact. He, however, found himself totally opposed to Gandhi's understanding and strategy for removing untouchability and resigned from it in 1933. Ambedkar attended the third Roundtable Conference proceedings from 17th November to 24th December 1932. He accepted a part-time professorship in the Government Law College, Bombay in June 1934, and after a year was appointed as the principal of this college for subsequent 3 years. However, his wife died on 27th May 1935. She had spent a life of loneliness and privation, saddened also by the loss of 3 sons and daughters. By 1935, Ambedkar had lost all hopes that Hinduism could be reformed. On 13th October 1935, at a meeting of depressed classes at Yola in Nasik, he suggested that people who belonged to these classes should give up Hinduism. In May 1936, he called a conference of Mahas to discuss this issue with them. Ambedkar's declaration of conversion provoked widespread reaction. Although some dialogue was initiated, particularly with the Sikhs, he was to put off the issues of conversion for the next 20 years. His later writings demonstrate that he did not forget the issue and took an intense study of Hinduism and comparative religion for the next 20 years. In 1936, Ambedkar wrote a long speech called Annihilation of Caste to address the Jat Pat Thodak Mandal, an organization for social reforms based on Lahore, as it invited him to preside over their annual conference. He cancelled his appointment with the Mandal following a disagreement with it regarding certain passages in the text. However, the address which he published generated an intense debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar regarding the nature of Hinduism and how to engage with it. In late 1930s, Ambedkar attempted to broad base some of his concerns. He introduced a bill for the abolition of the Koti system of land tenure in the Bombay Legislative Assembly in 1936. On 15th August 1936, he founded the Independent Labour Party, which contested 17 seats in the elections of 1937 and won 15 of them. In 1938, he joined hands with the left in Bombay to oppose the Industrial Trade Dispute Bill introduced in the Bombay legislature, a bill that was perceived as seeking to impose curbs on labour movement. He also extended his cooperation to the government in its war efforts. However, it was qualified support. He felt that the appeal of Pakistan for Muslims masses was on account of the failure of the Congress to strive for social reforms and democratize society. He repeated those concerns in an important paper presented on the 10th birth anniversary of Ranade at the Kogale Institute, Pune in 1943. He argued that once an identity becomes a political force, then the consequences of its formation have to be faced. Once Muslims constituted themselves on a separate platform, in a decisive sense, he saw no alternative to forging an identity-based front to demand a share of power. It led to the founding of the Scheduled Caste Foundation in July 1942 in the wake of the Cripps Commission in that year. Ambedkar began to project the scheduled caste as a third party other than the Hindus and Muslims in the constitutional development sought in India. In December 1942, Ambedkar wrote Mr. Gandhi and Emancipation of Untouchables for a conference in Quebec organized by the Pacific Relations Committee. Ambedkar was appointed a member of the Viceroy's Council on 27th July 1942 for a period of 5 years. It was during this period that Ambedkar, as a labor member of the council, worked out a fairly comprehensive policy for reservation for scheduled caste in the services. Several labor legislatures were enacted and the tripartite linkages between labor, industry and government were built. It was also during this period that foundations for a comprehensive welfare legislation for labor was designed. Ambedkar also took a great deal of interest in some of the major multi-purpose developmental projects such as Damodar Valley Corporation and the Mahanadi River projects. In fact, it was designing the foundations of the emerging welfare state that Ambedkar played a major role. Apart from his ideological orientations and studies, this experience made him seek the portfolio of planning that was denied to him in the Nehru cabinet in 1951. Ideologically charged, the interventions continued even at a time of political upheavals. Perhaps the most significant was what the Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables, a tract written in 1945. This was an attempt to carve out the autonomous constituency of scheduled castes. It was in the same strain as his political efforts during this period. In 1946, he published Who Were the Sudras, which, while showering the internal cleavages of Hinduism, held Brahmins to ridicule. In the Untouchables, Ambedkar brought the untouchables throughout India on a common platform as being broken men and also reduced to the position of untouchables by the stratagems of Brahmins. Apart from their scholarship, these works by Ambedkar clearly showed his intention to try wresting control over the scheduled castes from Gandhi and Brahminism and reach out to the non-Brahminical constituency. As law minister, Ambedkar formulated several important bills, including the Hindu Code Bill. The latter was in a way an attempt by Ambedkar to effectively transform the hierarchical relations embodied in the Hindu family and the caste system and bring them in tune with the values that were embodied in the constitution. The constitutional provisions, his arguments for state socialism and the transformation of the Hindu order were attempts to implement single-handedly his project of the 1920s, although others may have evinced interest in these projects for their own reasons. In fact, Ambedkar was riding piggyback to bring about this transformation. The strong opposition to the Hindu Code Bill from Orthodox Hindus eventually sabotages this program. In this 1950s, Ambedkar turned to Buddhism as personal faith and as an ideology that offered an alternative to Hinduism. In 1949, he endorsed the World Buddhist Conference in Kathmandu on Marxism versus Buddhism. He wrote a paper in the Journal of Mahabodhi Society in 1950 on the Buddha and future of his religion. He visited Colombo in 1954 to personally study the practice of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. He also attended the World Buddhist Conference in Rangoon in 1955. On 14 October 1956, he formally converted to Buddhism along with lakhs of his followers. That it was not a simple socially neutral journey was evident when Ambedkar administered a set of oaths to his followers to vow that they would renounce certain practices that tied them to Hinduism. Along with Buddhism, the ideology that deeply attracted him in the 1950s was Marxism. In fact, in November 1956, he made a trip to Nepal to attend the World Buddhist Conference, where he spoke on Karl Marx and Buddha. There was honors that came his way in 1950s. The Doctor of Laws conferred to him by the Columbia University at its special convention on 5th June 1952, and the D.Litt degree bestowed by the Osmania University. Summary. Dear students, in this lesson we have discussed the topic of life sketch of B.R. Ambedkar. Unless we learn the life sketch of Ambedkar, we cannot understand clearly about the ideologies and works of B.R. Ambedkar. In the next lecture, we can see the methodology which was adopted by Ambedkar, his works and his concepts, social and political ideologies of Ambedkar. Thank you.